Because I am clearly a glutton for punishment, I've decided to bring back a vaguely noticeable segment on Sports Central, part of the Closing Tag Network. So if you recall, a couple months ago, I changed NBA history by making one small little change. And that was, instead of the Houston Rockets drafting Hakeem Olajuwon in the 1984 NBA draft, they drafted Michael Jordan. Well, we're bringing back What If, but this time I want to touch on a different draft class. And in order to do that, I need to go back. I need to go way back. The date is July 19th, 1976, and unbeknownst to anybody involved, NBA history is about to be changed forever. The New Orleans Jazz, at the time, was a struggling but by no means terrible franchise. Desperate to find a scoring partner to pair up with their megastar point guard Pete Maravich, the Jazz signed one of the greats at that time, the Los Angeles Lakers guard Gail Goodrich. So much, well, now for reasons that I'm not entirely aware of, there was a legal snafu in the signing. So much so, in fact, that the Jazz were forced to draft or trade several draft assets to the Lakers for Goodrich. In total, the trade sent Goodrich to New Orleans, along with the Lakers' 1977 second-round pick and their 1978 first-round pick, while the Lakers would receive New Orleans' first-round picks in 1977, 1978, 1979, as well as their second-round pick in 1980. Now, the reason why this is so significant and so important is because the 1979 pick, as many know, turned out to be none other than Earvin Magic Johnson. Magic would go on to be a cornerstone along with Hall of Fame center Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for what was known in the 80s as the Showtime Lakers, helping them to win 5 NBA championships in that time span. Now, the question I always hear all the time from Jazz fans here in Utah is, what if the Jazz didn't have to trade that pick to the Lakers? This episode of What If goes one step further. And today's butterfly that we are stepping on today on this edition of What If is, what if the New Orleans Jazz didn't sign Gail Goodrich? Now, at the last What If scenario that I proposed, if I can find my spot, there we go. That presented very little negative change for any of the parties involved, except for maybe the Pacers. Sorry. Today's What If scenario promises to have radical ramifications throughout the entire league, maybe even the world of sports as we know it. So let's rewind it back to the 1976 season. The New Orleans Jazz are desperate to look for any additional help so they can lighten Maravich's scoring load. However, in the Western Conference, there's one team that's also anxious for scoring help at the 2 guard, the Chicago Bulls. Now, don't get me wrong, they had a really nice shooting guard at the time by the name of Jerry Sloan. Jerry Sloan, though, wasn't really a scorer. He was more of a gritty, tough defender. But seeing that their star forward, Bob Love, was nearing the end of his career, along with practically the entire starting lineup, the Bulls in our universe never properly transitioned to a younger scorer until many years later when they had the third overall pick in the 1984 draft, and you already know how that goes. However, what if it were the Chicago Bulls and not the New Orleans Jazz who signed Gail Goodrich? The Lakers, still desperate for compensation, would still get their first round picks in 1977, 78, and 79, but instead of coming from New Orleans, they would be coming from Chicago. Goodrich would continue to struggle similarly as he did in New Orleans in our universe after suffering a terrible injury about a quarter of the way through the 1976-77 season. Meanwhile, the New Orleans Jazz in 1976-77 would still struggle mightily to get out the gate, only the struggle would be mightily expedited with no solid number 2 scorer to take the scoring load off of Maravich. Maravich was beginning to get very frustrated with the situation and would likely demand that the brass in the Big Easy, quote, handle it. With a very poor record of 25-57, the New Orleans Jazz would get the number 2 overall pick, which they would use to draft Otis Birdsong. Don't worry, this isn't the big earth-shattering change that I'm referring to. That comes later. Meanwhile, the Bulls pick lands the Lakers Brad Davis a pick earlier than they got him in our universe, landing him with the 14th pick, while they land Bo Ellis with the 16th pick and Norm Nixon with the 22nd. With the 1978 season coming, the winds of change gust through the Big Easy. The Jazz ownership group are growing more cash-strapped, more desperate, and more frustrated with the Pete Maravich situation by the day. But a funny thing happened. The New Orleans Jazz actually turned things around. Riding the momentum of all-star campaigns from both their draft pick, Otis Birdsong, and Truck Robinson, the Jazz would actually make the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. The result, an embarrassing first-round exit at the hands of the eventual NBA champion Washington Bullets. Oh, and in case you're following at home, the Los Angeles Lakers would fall in the first round to the eventual Western Conference champion, Seattle Supersonics. The 78 draft would still see the Lakers shipping the first round pick they got from Chicago to Boston, where they would take Freeman Williams. However, with the Jazz moving on up, they would not draft until the 16th pick in the draft, where they would select Jack Givens. Now, you might ask yourself, who the fuck is Jack Givens? And I respond with, don't worry about it. Financially strapped even after making the playoffs for the first time ever, Jazz owner Sam Barrystone begins negotiations with the NBA to possibly relocate the team. To gain capital to help finance the possible relocation, Jazz management had to make a very tough and very difficult decision, essentially selling the contract of Pistol Pete Maravich to the Boston Celtics in exchange for $2 million and draft compensation. More on that in a minute. The first reality-altering domino has just dropped. Keep in mind, it was in 1978, that same year, that Boston would draft a certain hick from French Lick in the NBA draft. And that still happens in this reality. So the pair of Pistol Pete Maravich and Larry Bird hit it off almost immediately. Despite having all-star level numbers from Spencer Haywood, Otis Birdsong, and Truck Robinson, the Jazz never got off the ground, finishing with the worst record in the league at 20 wins and 62 losses. Meanwhile, the Celtics didn't do a lot better at 32 and 50. Both teams missed the playoffs. The Lakers, in the meantime, lose in the second round to the eventual world champion Seattle Supersonics. Now comes the bomb. Bear Stone and Jazz management are unable to procure enough funding to relocate the Jazz organization out of New Orleans and are forced to sell the team. A wealthy businessman originally from Chicago is interested in bringing the NBA back to St. Louis, Missouri, where there hasn't been basketball since a few years prior when the ABA folded. And while the city of New Orleans gives a great message of wanting to keep the Jazz in New Orleans, new ownership moves the team to St. Louis. So congratulations, Jazz fans! Yes, in this universe, Magic Johnson is drafted by the Jazz, but they're drafted by the St. Louis Jazz. And the Utah Jazz never exist. In fact, the NBA and pro sports in general don't even bother Salt Lake City at all. Instead, years later, your friendly neighbor to the north, Boise, Idaho, ends up getting the relocated Kansas City Kings. So instead of relocating from Sacramento or from Kansas City to Sacramento like they do in our universe, these Kansas City Kings end up relocating to Boise, Idaho, and become the Boise Kings. Without a proper funding for a proper relocation, the Bear Stone Group are forced to sell the New Orleans Jazz rather than relocate it to Salt Lake City, as it happened in our universe. This means no Stockton to Malone. This means no Larry H. Miller. This means no Olympics. And this means no Real Salt Lake. No professional sports of any kind ever come to Salt Lake City. Congratulations. But we're not done there. That's only the first ripple effect. Without Magic Johnson, the Showtime Lakers never exist. The Lakers as we know them are a middle-of-the-road organization contending with teams like Kansas City and Denver rather than the elites. Magic instead becomes a rock star in St. Louis, creating an intense rivalry over the years with Detroit's Isaiah Thomas. Meanwhile, Boston becomes the dynasty of the 80s, winning 7 of the decade's 10 NBA championships, including 2 back-to-back that would send Pistol Pete Maravich off into the sunset. Bye-bye. A quick year-by-year look at the highlights of each season. 1980 would see the Boston Celtics face off against the defending champion Seattle Supersonics in the finals, in which the Celtics win. The Lakers would be eliminated in the first round by the Phoenix Suns, and the St. Louis Jazz would be eliminated in the first round by the Seattle Supersonics. 1981 would see a return to the NBA Finals for the Boston Celtics, this time against the Houston Rockets, in which they would win their second straight NBA championship, allowing Pistol Pete Maravich to retire as a champion. St. Louis would lose in the first round to Houston. The Lakers would lose in the first round to Portland. 1982 would be one of the rare occasions the Celtics don't win an NBA championship in this decade in this universe, as they would lose in the Eastern Conference Finals to the Philadelphia 76ers. The Lakers would actually make it to the second round of the playoffs, where they would lose to the Midwest Division champion St. Louis Jazz. Those same Jazz would lose to Phoenix in the Western Conference Finals, who would lose to Philadelphia in the NBA Finals. Frustrated with how things are going in St. Louis, Magic Johnson demands the Jazz management resolves the issues surrounding the team. However, the new ownership has much bigger problems to deal with. Attendance was worst in the league in 1982, not just for the Jazz, but for the entire league. Here's another ripple effect. Revenue is down across the board, and unless something is done soon, the league may be forced to fold. Jazz ownership makes a bold move to help revitalize the league and drive attendance up. In one of the craziest series of moves in sports history, all in one 3-month period in the summer of 1982, the following ended up happening. The St. Louis Jazz announced that they are relocating to Los Angeles, California, where they would play at the LA Sports Arena, where the Clippers in our universe would ultimately play until co-renting the Staples Center. Meanwhile, the Kansas City Kings, as I mentioned before, would relocate to Boise, Idaho, and the state of Missouri would be left without an NBA franchise at all. Ouch. Meanwhile, the San Diego Clippers, seeing that there are already 2 NBA franchises in Los Angeles, instead relocate to Orlando, Florida. Yes, the Orlando Clippers. Okay then. The play worked as more eyeballs shifted to Los Angeles and Magic Johnson, and the additional revenue from the bigger market allowed the Jazz to trade for both Darrell Griffith and Adrian Dantley. The pieces were finally in place. So you had Magic at the point, Griffith at the 2, and Dantley at the 3. That's a pretty solid lineup right there. Plus, they would still draft Mark Eaton, so there's your starting center right there. Boston would get swept in the second round by Milwaukee in 1983. The Lakers would lose in the first round to the Jazz in what would be deemed the Battle for Los Angeles. The Jazz would then lose in the second round to San Antonio, who would lose in the NBA Finals to Philadelphia. 1984 would see the Los Angeles Lakers lose in the first round to Boise. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar would soon announce his retirement, and the Lakers would never be the same again. As for their cross-city rivals, the Los Angeles Jazz, that feels dirty saying that, they would go on to the NBA Finals, where they would lose to the Boston Celtics. In fact, the Los Angeles Jazz and the Boston Celtics would meet in the NBA Finals in 1984, 1985, 1986, and 1987, in which every single time the Celtics would come out on top. But the Los Angeles Jazz would finally win their first NBA championship by defeating the Detroit Pistons in 1988. The Magic versus Bird rivalry in the finals that sparked the league in the 80s in our universe would do the exact same in this universe, but with the Jazz being the benefactors of Magic playing in LA and not the Lakers. Meanwhile, after his grand plan came crashing down, Dr. Jerry Buss would sell the Lakers to an investment group from the Midwest who decided to move the team back to its roots and reincarnate the Minneapolis Lakers. Again, okay. The Jazz would move into the form where they would call home until the stadium was demolished to make room for what would be called in this universe the Sam Barristone Stadium, named after the former owner of the organization. Magic Johnson would retire from the NBA in 1991, much like he did in our universe, but instead of being remembered as the guy that brought 5 NBA championships to the Lakers, he would be remembered as the guy that brought 2 NBA championships to the Jazz and brought the Jazz to Los Angeles, forcing the Lakers to move back to Minneapolis. The league announced in 1994 that it would be expanding the league to 29 teams by adding a team back in New Orleans, and that it struck a deal with the ownership group in Los Angeles to allow the new franchise to retake the name Jazz. So once again, we have the New Orleans Jazz. A petition would be passed around in Los Angeles, and the fans in LA agreed that the only appropriate name for the former Jazz would be the Los Angeles Magic. So let's recap for a second. There's no Utah Jazz. New Orleans is still the Jazz, only this time around it's an expansion franchise. The Kings call Boise, Idaho home. The Lakers are back in Minneapolis. The Clippers are in Orlando. All the other expansion franchises are still pretty much in effect, like Miami, Charlotte, Toronto, Vancouver. And there's an NBA expansion team coming to Kansas City? Huh? And I know you're asking, what, pray tell, happened to Karl Malone and John Stockton in all of this, you may ask. Well, I'll tell you. Stockton would end up going to the Seattle Supersonics, where he would be closer to his folks. And Karl Malone would be originally drafted by Milwaukee before being traded after the expansion franchise to New Orleans. The thing that most Jazz fans fail to realize when they do the whole fantasy drafting of Magic Johnson to the Jazz instead of the Lakers is that if not for the fact that they traded a ton of draft picks, including the Magic Johnson draft pick for Gail Goodrich, the Jazz likely would not last long enough to relocate to Utah in the first place. Jazz organization were so strapped for cash despite the fact that they played their home games at the Superdome in New Orleans, where the basketball seating arrangement could easily hold north of 30,000 people. And yet they were still struggling. And without Magic Johnson in a prime market that highlights his abilities, the NBA as we know it may not even exist. Whether fans want to admit it or not, Magic Johnson being in Los Angeles was a perfect fit for everybody. His ability to play and his showmanship were just solid for a town like Los Angeles to showcase, and that brought more eyeballs to the sport than ever before. And it also allowed Jerry Buss and the Bus family and the organization for Los Angeles to be able to financially afford to stay in Los Angeles. The NBA, instead of struggling into the mid to late 80s the way that they were during the early 80s, actually grew bigger and better than ever at the moment at that time. There are a lot of players and a lot of fans, myself included, that probably would never even watch the NBA or grow up being fans of the NBA if not for Magic Johnson and the Lakers. It is tough for me to say that honestly, but it's the truth. Keep in mind that the NBA was struggling so badly back in the early 80s that the 1980 NBA Finals were aired on tape delay. Can you imagine the finals last year between Denver and Miami being aired on tape delay? And honestly, selling the draft picks, selling the Magic Johnson draft pick was really the only thing that could have saved the Utah Jazz, well, the New Orleans Jazz at the time, and helped assist them relocate to Salt Lake City. So as much as it pains me to admit this, and as much as it pains most Jazz fans to admit this, we owe Jerry Buss, Gail Goodrich, and the Los Angeles Lakers a huge debt of gratitude. Because if not for that move, the entire landscape, not just of the NBA, but of all professional sports, would be dramatically different. And not in a very good way. I want to hear your thoughts about this. I've gone on for about 28 minutes. So it's about that time. So I want to let you guys know there is probably going to be another Sports Central episode dropping tomorrow. I wanted to have my thoughts about the NFL playoffs, but I wanted to wait until the last two games ended up playing. So on that note, I want to recommend that you guys leave a review on Spotify, like, share, and comment the video on Facebook. If you're watching this on YouTube, like the video, hit the bell for notifications. That way you're notified. Also subscribe to the channel. Subscriptions are free and they are amazing. And a very quick note, we are going to be going away on Google Podcasts come April. Google Podcasts is going to be transitioning over to YouTube. So I am in the process of making a few changes to the podcast so that it's more YouTube friendly. So just keep an eye out for that. And until the next time that I grace you with my presence, which will likely be tomorrow, remember to include your closing tags. Thanks.